Meanwhile, Michael O'Hanlon is here. And Michael is, as I mentioned earlier, one of my favorite guests because not only is he a great guy, but he's the go-to guy to give us a concise wrap-up of the troubles in the world and the truth about what's happening in Israel and Palestine and Yemen, our Middle East strategy, Ukraine, and more. And he does it all without taking 2 hours of homework home every night.
Yeah, he does.
He's kind of a magician.
Yeah.
Good morning,
He
Michael.
doesn't give you honey homework.
I try to do some homework.
So how old are your kids now?
Oh, they're old. They're practically retired. They're 20 and 21.
Okay, so you're not helping them with their homework anymore because that ship has sailed.
Yeah, I try not to. You never know.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
He did say he likes homework.
Yeah, no,
Yeah,
well, he's a very
right.
smart
It's
guy.
fun.
I remember when I could no longer help my kids with the homework and I started cheating off other parents in the neighborhood. So,
It's a good plan.
all right, Michael, let me start with a subject that has been backburnered here. And we're not talking about funding of the same, but what is an update on Ukraine and the Ukraine-Russia war?
Well, the most recent update is the good news from Europe that the European Union just agreed to this 50 billion euro, or sort of, I guess, $55 billion package that Hungary had been, blocking, and now it's going to go through. So that's a strong shot in the arm for Ukraine in terms of primarily financial aid. Doesn't really solve the ammunition shortages they've got in air defense and artillery and things like that, where our role is crucial. And as you know, it's still being held up. But it's still a big step forward and, a big relief.
Not to boil this down to a Die Hard movie, but is it as simple as they won't have bullets in the guns to shoot back at some point?
Well, since Die Hard was one guy against six, it's sort of not a bad analogy,
Right?
Because that one guy had to rely on his toughness and smarts and a little good luck, and Ukraine's in a similar position. Fortunately, they also have a very well built up front line. Both sides have a very well built up front line that makes it hard to make any offensive movement possible. My good friend at Columbia University, Steve Biddle, just wrote a great article in foreignaffairs.com explaining this, but it's also sort of intuitively obvious to a lot of us that when you've had that much time to build up a defense, it's pretty hard for an exposed individual or even exposed tank to come out and make much headway. So Ukraine still has that advantage working for them when they're on defense. They have that disadvantage when they're on offense, but none of that's going to change just based on a modest shortage of ammunition in the short term. Over the longer term, it certainly could. So if we cut off aid to Ukraine, then I have no way to predict what happens in let's say the second half of this year.
Right. Jane?
Curious about Biden's response to the drone attack in Jordan. I heard a report this morning that something is underway. What do you think his response will be, and what's happening with that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I tried to just sketch out some options in a little piece I did the other day on our website at Brookings. But one way to think about it is if you do feel like we have to escalate our response, and I think we do, and it probably has to directly affect Iran more than previous responses might have, then I think you've got options such as causing damage to some of their oil and gas export infrastructure. And you can do that through some kind of, sabotage with a short-range missile, or you could do it. You could also identify an IRGC, a Republican Guard, Revolutionary Guard headquarters somewhere in a relatively isolated place. So destroying that headquarters doesn't threaten civilians. With also the implied threat that you could do this again on a larger scale if they don't cut it out. And so that's the kind of response option that I would consider. We should also be sharing intelligence about what's been happening here more widely throughout the world, so other countries will begin to think about reimposing sanctions on Iran. Because as you know, under the 2015 nuclear deal, a lot of the sanctions were lifted, and then President Trump reimposed them and pulled out of the deal. But other countries are still in that deal and still doing some business with Iran. We could try to go after Iran's economy in addition to any military action with this kind of a campaign to persuade others that, whoever's side you were on Trump pulling out of the deal, Iran's behavior has now become so egregious that people should be punishing and hopefully deterring Iran from future action.
Israel and Gaza, it's a nightmare, and it doesn't seem to have any answers. I've said again and again, you can't kill an idea. You can't bomb an idea into oblivion. When does this end?
Well, it would be nice if the Israelis could mete out justice to 2 or 3 of the top leaders in Hamas. And that would go a long ways towards saying that Hamas's role in Gaza won't be the same in the future that it was in the past. I mean, of course, it can regenerate new leadership, and certainly Al-Qaeda and ISIS have done that over the years. But nonetheless, you could weaken the leadership. So I think an idea that it's not going to solve the problem tomorrow, but I'm surprised no one said it publicly. If these top leaders like Sinwar of Hamas would agree to step down, and maybe somebody could even give them asylum, although obviously Israel wants them dead. But if they were at least out of Gaza and there was some kind of binding commitment to keep them out, you wonder if that could then be the missing ingredient to help Israel finally agree to the ceasefire the United States is pushing. Because, as you know, Israel doesn't want a ceasefire with those people still at large and is worried it could never really resume operations after that. So I think getting that top leadership out, even if the idea persists, as you say, even if future leaders could be, grown from within the organization, the people who have the most blood on their hands, I think, need to be out of the picture one way or another. And that's the piece I think we don't talk about enough.
Does Netanyahu's politics of this include until they're dead, I can't stop?
Yes, and I understand why he feels that way in regard to the top leaders. It's not realistic to feel that way, again, as you said, in regard to the rank and file. And probably Israel knows that. But, if we think back to the 9/11 attacks here, obviously the day after or the week or month or even year after, we wanted al-Qaeda's leadership completely obliterated. And we spent a lot of time over the next 10 years or so, and even as recently as 2022, trying to make sure that happened. And ultimately had success against Osama bin Laden 10 years later and against Zawahiri in 2022 in Kabul, Afghanistan. So Israel's going to keep after the top leadership, and that makes sense. But they're not going to ever be able to obliterate the idea, as you say, or all the rank-and-file fighters, many of whom can't be identified and, keep regenerating anyhow. So they got to get a little bit more realistic of what they can accomplish.
With the war in Yemen, which we rarely talked about until this continued uprising by the Houthi rebels, is that something we're paying more attention to now because of this, or is that still number 3 on our depth chart?
Well, unfortunately, there was a little bit of good attention being paid to a peace process that's now more or less, OBE, and one hopes they can get back to it. But after many, many years of nasty fighting, as you point out, and also often neglect, we were trying to help cultivate this, at least, modus vivendi between the Houthis and the previous government in the south and its loyalists. And that process can't really continue while we're fighting the Houthis. So something's going to have to give here, and it probably is only going to give once there is a ceasefire in Gaza.
Is there any idea when Biden's and the Pentagon's response would hit? Would it be this week?
It's a good question. It was sort of interesting of Biden to say to that reporter that he had decided what he would do, but not to telegraph the timing. That's probably not a bad answer to the question. I would think that the longer it plays out, 2 separate things happen. One, people's rage sort of starts to soften, but also people's impatience with Biden starts to grow. And so I would think that on balance, unless they're still trying to develop a targeting option or waiting for something to happen, somebody to move or to relocate or what have you, they're probably going to act in the next few days, yes.
It's Michael O'Hanlon, as I always tell him. Too smart for this show, but he's good enough to keep coming back.
And there's so many more questions.
There are, and that's why we're going to need you back, Michael. But best of luck this weekend, and have a great time, and best to your family and your kids who are too smart for you.
Thank you all very much. Best wishes.
Take care. Michael. Director of Research and Senior Fellow of Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institution.